Hey, Link here. Thanks for joining me for episode 78, where I speak with Tomas Guy-nan. In this episode, we speak about the usual, like how he got into the industry, words of wisdom based on his experiences, the games that made them want to get into making games, what makes gaming enjoyable to them, and their current comfort games, as well as a bunch of NES-centric things such as NES games that don't get enough credit, NES games that don't really hold up today, and what they do outside of gaming. Before we get started, don't forget there are links in the episode description that you can follow to learn more about Thomas and the game Rugrats Adventure in Gameland, as well as the podcast. Also, don't forget to like and share the episode, and without further ado, enjoy episode 78. Hi, and welcome to the Red Tunic Podcast, a podcast where I look to rediscover what makes gaming fun and enjoyable by having positive conversations with those related to the industry. My name is Link, and today I'm joined by Tomas Guy-nan, the Mix Games co-founder, game dev at Spoony Bard, and Interbang Entertainment, and currently working on Rugrats Adventure in Gameland. Hi, Thomas. How are you doing today?
Not too bad, and you?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for asking. And now, Thomas, I apologize. I think even after checking, I screwed your last name up, didn't I?
No, it's Guinan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Good, thank you. I was reading it, and I don't know if you heard my little hitch there. My brain just sort of went sideways, but I'm glad. So thank you. So, Thomas, before we get started, would you mind telling me and anyone that's listening a little bit about yourself? And as well, when you're doing that, by all means, feel free to throw anything you'd like in there about your current projects.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Tomas Guy-nan. I'm based in Nova Scotia, Canada. And I'm an indie game developer. I've been doing it professionally, I'd say since about 2017. It's been my full time since 2019. Before that, I was um, I was still a computer dev. And yeah.
So awesome. Thank you for that. And it. Sorry, I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. So you went from being like a regular, I'm going to say boring programmer because let's
Yeah,
be
boring
honest.
programmer is fine. Yeah.
I'm a boring programmer, so like don't take that in any dismissive way. But no, so you went from being like a boring regular programmer to making games, or starting to make games. Before that, were you like, did you play around with like making games as little small projects, or did you kind of just go full into the deep end of the pool?
Yeah, so I mean, it's always been something I've been done as a side thing, just for my own interest's sake. Even going back to when I was a kid, I guess I'd say like an elder millennial age person. Like we got our first computer when I was a kid in 1994, I think it was, and one of the first things I wanted to be able to do back then, I was 13 years old. I wanted to make video games. So you had QBasic came bundled with DOS, and that was one of the first things I really jumped into. There was also a game called ZZT that had this really cool level editor with a programming language, and I made a few probably extremely terrible games with that in my teenage years. So it was just sort of something I was always into. And once the emulation and that scene sort of became a thing in the late 90s, I really got into that as well with ROM hacking and that sort of thing. So it was always something that I really enjoyed to do. But it was something I kind of never really you know, saw a way into professionally, whereas opposed to, you go to school, you get your computer science degree, and you kind of, do the right thing sort of thing. So I did that. And it actually ended up working out that as I was doing that, um, I sort of got back into around 2017 again, finding out about the NES homebrew scene, and I looked at that and thinking, wow, there are people making NES games. You know, that's the first generation that I grew up with the video games. I thought that was really cool. And then seeing it and thinking, I can do this. So I put together my first NES game and ran a Kickstarter for it. And it did pretty decent. So it was some nice side money and got a decent amount of attention in that homebrew NES scene, and that's kind of sort of where I started taking the indie dev thing professionally.
So, thank you for sharing that. And a few things. One that I really want to bounce off, and we can move on from it really quick. But as someone that was uh in the late '90s, I was hitting. I don't know, I was just starting to become a tween or hit the double digits effectively. Um, and it always baffles my mind when I think back on that era, kind of that the emulation scene for like Super Nintendo and Nintendo and such, that it existed. And I mean that in the sense of like the amount of support necessary to be reverse engineering and recreating that. It always blows my mind that people were doing that before the internet was really kind of at its peak for like being able to get help, right? Like that, you would have had like people would have been in like use groups or use nets and like doing all of that. And that just blows my mind that people were able to do that back then.
Oh
Um,
yeah, it is pretty crazy because even back then, like when I was doing it, I didn't even have an internet connection at home. I would go to the school library with 3.5-inch floppies, and I'd be downloading emulators and ROMs and like utilities and stuff, and bringing them home and hoping that things worked.
So yeah, so when you 100% know exactly the angle or the path that I'm getting at there, because it's absolutely wild. It's just thinking about figuring things out before the internet, and especially in this case, before if I was working on like a school project, I'd go to like the library to get it like at an encyclopedia. That didn't exist for these things, and people figured it out and from scratch. It always just blows my mind. Um, and kind of in like the same carryover vein, how does it feel to be a person that made a Nintendo game in the late 2000s or sorry, the past that, coming up like how does it feel to be someone making a Nintendo game like 40 odd years after its existence or what have you? That's the way to ask it.
Yeah, it's pretty surreal, and I think what's the more surreal thing about it to me isn't just the fact that that I can that I'm doing it, which that in itself felt so surreal to me from the start that like when I first started doing it, I was like, wow, I'm making NES games and they're playing on NES hardware. But then when it got to the point where, I started collaborating with Limited Run, getting contracts and that sort of thing. And it was to the point, it's like, I'm not just making NES games, but I'm doing it professionally. Like, you know, 30 years after the system stopped being produced, it is a surreal it's a very surreal.
um so yeah, and yeah, I think you more than, like I can kind of empathetically understand that. But like you are actively there. So yeah, I get why it would be surreal and it just I, I don't think there's like a really nice easy way for me to even put into words to try and encapsulate like how to say that must be absolutely bonkers that when you're sitting there you're like, yeah, this is a game I'm making that's going to play on the Nintendo. Like yes, it's easy to say that, but like the everything surrounding it is very, in my mind, for me, very hard to try and like put that into terms that actually fully expresses just how bananas that is, right?
Yeah, and the level of bananas has, it kinda snowballs too because it starts, you start out and just the fact that you're doing it is crazy, and, like, right now, say, like, with, Rugrats, with the current game that we're wrapping up, it's like I'm working with Paramount, that's like one of the biggest companies in the world, to make like and Rugrats was like at one point, I think in the 90s, it was like the largest children's franchise of the 90s, and I'm, working on a game for that for, obsolete hardware that is going to be released that people are, and people are hyped about it. And it's a it's a very surreal feeling because I feel like everything about that, it feels like shouldn't exist, but here I am.
And speaking of the game you're working, Rugrats Adventure in Gameland, um, the one thing that even wilder in my mind is the Nintendo was already done by the time Rugrats was on TV. So not only are you working on a game for an obsolete system, this was a system that didn't exist or wasn't really being like whatevered when the series came out. So it's not even like you're making a period piece game. That's a weird way to put that, but I think you know what I mean. You're making like a previous period piece game. um
Yeah, although to be fair, this is one I've had, and I always counter to this is that Rugrats, it started its run in 1991, and it was the same year as Ren and Stimpy, and Ren and Stimpy had an NES game, and so did Darkwing Duck. So it was kind of that borderline point between NES and Super Nintendo where a lot of the kid stuff was still getting games. So it's kind of that sweet spot to me.
so I'm not gonna lie, I honestly thought Rugrats came a few years later, but 90, okay, so
Yeah.
91, that's it's
Yep.
older than I remember.
Yeah.
um I feel slightly older than I thought I was. Anyway, what have you. But speaking of, the Rugrats game that you're working on, I had a chance to watch it being played at PAX, and I'm gonna say a few things, and this isn't meant to be in a bad way. It'll all make sense at the end. I did not try it. I refused to try it because the person I was speaking with about it was also watching over and talking with a mother and a daughter that were playing it. And the mother looked about my age, and the daughter looked about the age I would have been when I was playing like Nintendo games. So like 4, 5, 6-ish, what have you. And he asked, he's like, "Yeah, did you want to try it?" And I think at one point she was like, "Yeah, we can go." And I was like, "No, no, I know how a Nintendo game plays. I don't mean that in a negative way. It looks like a Nintendo game in all the best ways, but also I did not have any intention of interrupting what was surely going to be a wild core memory for this girl, for this mother and daughter, right? So like, I haven't had a chance to put my hands on it. However, watching it, it looked absolutely fantastic, and it looked exactly like a Nintendo game should. Um, and saying that in 2023 about a brand new Nintendo game is incredibly weird. Um, because if I'm not mistaken, uh, at PAX it was the actual Nintendo playing it, right?
Yeah, we did. We had it was actually my one of my childhood Nintendo systems. It was the I bought it at a local secondhand store when my brother kind of commandeered our original NES system. So I bought myself one at the like local secondhand comic book store type place, and that's the same one that I brought with me. So
So which is also funny to hear that it's not only is it was it being played on Nintendo, it was being played on a very old Nintendo,
oh yeah,
um,
very old.
and not like a redo or what have you. Um, but yeah, so I haven't had a chance to play it. I'm looking forward to it, obviously. But like I said, I had no intention of interrupting what looked like a fantastic memory for a mother and a daughter. Because like I said, it in all the best ways, it looks exactly like an old Capcom Nintendo game or what have you, right? Um, which I also realize a lot of people probably not might not know what that even means, which is also a shame in 2023.
No, but that's about the highest praise you can give to an NES game is to say it looks like a Capcom game, honestly. So that's pretty great to hear. Um, but yeah, our like the team really because it was more than just me. The whole team really put in so much like the for the graphics and the music and everything about it. It's such a solid feeling game. And there were some I know some of the people in the feedback too where you have that sort of fuzziness in people's brains are sometimes a little fuzzier when it comes to this, and that some people thought it looked more like a Super Nintendo game than an NES game, which was kinda cool to hear as well, even though it is, I guess to a trained eye, you could tell the difference, but to the untrained eye, for it to sort of have that late NES borderline, um, thought, it was really cool to hear that from some people. And also just like you were saying, like the mother and the daughter playing, there was um, we demoed it, at PAX, and we also demoed it at, New York Comic Con recently, and seeing those, like, families playing and people playing with their kids was it was some of the most fun that I had watching people demo the game because you had these parents that were kind of immediately nostalgic because it was the it was a cartoon they grew up with, and it's the same era of game that they grew up with, so it sort of just tugs at those nostalgia strings in 2 different ways, and I think that's kind of something that, I'm really happy to see that people are responding that way because that's what we're really hoping that that's sort of the response we would get.
And, like, from when I believe it was one of the honestly, I apologize at this point, I can't remember who I was speaking with, um, but, like, when I was speaking with them, uh, about it and, about just the watching the mother and the daughter as well, it was, it was just great because like it's something that he mirrored or had also kind of said that that was something that they'd seen like a few times and like people were immediately taking to it. And like I said, I was perfectly fine not trying it because again, in no negative way, I grew up with a Nintendo. I have a good idea of exactly what it will be from what I could see. And I didn't want to in any way interrupt the mother and the daughter, just as I'm sure, the mother was probably happy. I was like, no, no, I'm not. Don't just keep going, just keep going.
No, I totally understand that.
So, Thomas, I am curious, because we kind of covered how you got started into making games. So I'm not gonna hit you too hard with that one. However, what I will say, or I will ask, I guess, is if there is any kind of wisdom, words of wisdom that you can share from the experiences you had getting into making games.
N I really think something you need to do is just kind of dive into it, and I don't necessarily mean that as in, quit your job without any and jump right in without any focus whatsoever, but one of the biggest things, especially early on, and I think a lot of people do this when they're hobbyists, you start projects that you kind of never finish. And there's definitely a big backlog of those that I've had over the years. But if you can start something that you finish and you're able to make a fun experience, then people are going to take note of that. And I think that's a really good way to jump into things. A few years ago, I probably would have said Kickstarter is a good way too, but I think, um, it's kind of become there's sort of a bit of a negative connotation, I think, unfortunately, that's happened with that, where it's like, there's so many, unfulfilled projects and that sort of thing that it makes people a little hesitant. But if you've got, there's game jams, there's itch.io is a great site just for, sort of a risk-free way to share things and just finding a community. Um, because you've sort of got the big sea of game development, but it's split up into all these smaller indie communities. And if you can find a community that you can sort of latch on to and have people that share interest in like a genre or a platform or anything like that, I think that's also a really important thing.
So, thank you for that advice. And I think um I think both of those things are like really really good ways to go about it. Just diving into it. Um, not with the caveat of not, quitting your day job and going all in. That makes sense because you're never, if you're always hesitant, just sort of dipping your toes in, you're never gonna take that full step, right? Like kind of like getting into a pool. You gotta go full in, or you're just gonna be a little chicken at the edge with your feet in and never commit. Or at least that's how it is for me. It's jump in or don't go in at all. Um,
Yeah.
but then finding a community I also think is a great way to go, especially with the mention of like game jams or what have you. Because I try and follow some game jams. It's hard because there's so many of them, so many interesting ones. But like um when you look into them, there's usually like a game jam that is going to resonate with you. And if it resonates with you, it's probably because it means something to you, and the people that are participating in it as well probably means something to them. So, like, that's a nice way to find a community, I would imagine, because, at some level, everyone that's involved is going to have like the same kind of investment or the same kind of like what have you towards the concept, which will make it easy to talk with people and grow and all that other fun stuff. Um, Words that I can't think of off the top of my head right now, but I hope that makes sense.
No, for sure.
So thank as I said, thank you for the words of wisdom from that. I appreciate you sharing that, and I think it makes sense. Now I am also curious because you said you got into gaming relatively early. You got like your first computer in, I think you said 1994. I imagine you were playing games on the Nintendo prior to that, or some form of gaming prior to that, or around that time. Was there a game or multiple games, however you want to take this, that made you want to make games? Now, I know you mentioned, I think it was the ZZT editor, and you mentioned the ROM hacking or what have you when emulation became a thing. But was that pretty much it that made you go, oh, this is definitely the thing that I want to do, or was there like a game that you played at some point that made you go, no, no, this is the thing that is like a core influence or what have you? Like, did you have one of those, or was it what we kind of covered earlier?
I'm really not sure. It's a really hard one for me to pick because it's sort of something I just always wanted to do ever since I first, like, I can't even remember exactly when I got the NES. I think it was 89, 88 or 89 that we got the original, just the NES with the Mario Duck Hunt bundle. Um, and, that I mean, just that, I mean, the amount of times that I played through Super Mario Brothers since then, and I think the next game we got was Zelda. Um, the first Zelda might even be it actually, because that game, it was my dad and me and my brother. My brother's 16 months younger than me, so it's like we're pretty close in age. Um, but my dad and where it had the three save files, it was kind of perfect because the three of us all were just like totally enthralled with that game. And my dad used to draw out maps on graph paper, and he would play it while we were in bed, and then he would show us like where certain secrets were and all this kind of stuff. Um, which is funny because my dad never was actually a lot of the time really a huge gamer, but every once in a while there was a game that really kinda grabbed him, and, that was the first one that I remember really, really grabbing him, was Zelda, and just, I think it felt so big too at the time compared to, compared to Mario and compared to other games that we had, like, rented and stuff, but that was the second one that we actually owned, and, then when you beat it, then there's a second quest, and it was like a whole separate game, and it's like breaking all the rules. There's like invisible walls and everything's super hard, and it was like, so it was just something about like the complexity and stuff of that I think really enthralled me. So I've always kind of had a special spot for the Zelda series ever since that. Uh, So I'd say that's probably like the game that really kind of made it kind of a real interest. And because ever since then, like I definitely wanted to make games, and it was on the NES that I first wanted to. I even remember thinking like, I wonder if there's some way, because I had no idea how the cartridges actually worked, but if there's some way that I had, like, metal contacts and was, like, able to scrape them up a certain way and stick them in an NES console, if it would just play some, like, garbage looking game, and because I didn't know, I just thought that, like, all the pins must have had all the different, you know, the different graphics in them or something. Because if it was dirty, it would be garbled and all that kinda stuff, so that it just fascinated me, the way that it worked fascinated me, and I had no idea at the time. Um, so yeah, if I really had to nail it down, I'd probably say the first Zelda.
So, thank you for sharing that. And it's always funny to hear about, parents that aren't really big into gaming getting hooked into gaming. Like my father plays well, he plays a lot of Team Fortress 2, but he does enjoy like playing games, and he's played, he has enough and he's played a lot. Um However, my mother was someone that did not play games. And for a similar thing to like your father, for her it was Bomberman. And I don't know if it just never went back to the rental place or what have you. But Bomberman showed up one day, and that was basically what she was doing with it. Um, which is a much harder game to like draw maps and show people. Be like, yeah, this is what you can do because it's Bomberman, right? You blow
Yeah.
everything up, go through the door. Um, but no, but thank you for sharing that, because I think it's always wonderful to hear like about a non-gaming parent like just getting into that and then kind of doing that with their kids. Um, Now I am curious because there's something you said that I'm wondering how the answer will for this will go. And if, I imagine this might be something you've thought about or someone might have jokingly asked you before, just given the context of what you do or what you've been doing. But if you could go back in time to like 6-year-old you or however old you would have been in the early '90s, and be like, hey, so guess what? In like 40 years, you're gonna make a Nintendo game. Like, how do you think that would go?
Yeah, I've thought about that one a lot actually. It's it would be pretty surreal. That's all I can say is like, 'cause I remember people joking about it when I was, I think about 12 or so, when it was like, it was a couple years into the Super Nintendo being out, and I was still playing my NES because a lot of people, they get a new system and they'll trade in their old one and all their old games so they could, trade up or whatever. And I never wanted to do that. I wanted to keep and hold on to those old games because I still love them and I still wanted to go back and play them. And I remember getting teased a little bit for it because people said to me like something like, when you're an adult, you're probably still gonna be playing, like, old Nintendo games, and, I guess they weren't wrong, but, then I was making them too, so it was pretty funny. It just I always think back on that kid that said that to me when I was, like, 12.
It's one of those kind of like what is it? In the middle of the night kind of things where if like, you wish the George Costanza moment where like the comeback comes to you in the middle of the night, except for you in your case now the comeback comes to you in the middle of the night 20 or so years later. Like damn right I will, and I'll be making them too. You watch or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
Uh so Thomas, if it's okay if you I'm going to kind of excuse me for 1 second.
sure.
Sorry about that. If it's okay with you, I'm gonna kind of stick around the Nintendo, mainly because, um, mainly because you're making a game from the Nintendo. Uh, you played a lot of Nintendo. Like, I just think if it's okay with you, this might be a good fitting context wise to the episode, or at least for now.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm curious because earlier we talked, or you agreed or acknowledged, or however you want to think about this one, that like one of the highest praises that a Nintendo game could get was that it had like that Capcom feel. And for those that don't know what that means, that's Capcom was effectively like just some of the best platformers for the Nintendo uh, in like every way possible. Graphics wise, like their sprite work was really good. The audio was, or the music, the what have you, the soundtrack was always really good. The gameplay was typically unique and varied. So like there's reasons to say that something was kind of like it looked and feels or what have you like a Capcom game that has some weight to it. Now Thomas, I'm sure you already know all that. This is for everyone else or anyone that's listening, but anyway, um so not focusing on like the Capcom level games because there was very few outside of Capcom that were like that. However, I'm wondering if there was a Nintendo game, and this could be something you found later in life, or what have you. But if there's a Nintendo game that you feel just didn't get enough credit, or for whatever reason, like maybe it was just overlooked when it came out, um, maybe it was something you found yourself and realized was really nice. Like I'm not saying how you have to take this angle with it. I'm just putting some out there. But the core of the question, I guess, is was there a Nintendo game that you really enjoyed that you think other people should give another chance, or just didn't give enough of a chance, or what have you?
Um, this is gonna be probably a little bit of a hot take, but these are games that when I was a kid, I actually genuinely liked, and they're pretty popular to rip on now. But I actually really liked a lot of the Wisdom Tree games. Like, I thought Spiritual Warfare was actually a pretty decent Zelda clone. Exodus was a pretty good puzzler, and I liked King of Kings. The rest of them I wasn't really into, but those 3 specific Wisdom Tree games, it's kind of a cheat answer, I guess, but they were actually pretty solid, especially for unlicensed, content. If you take anything out all the other elements out of it, like the Bible questions and all that stuff that, whatever, but just, like, the actual games, they weren't the one with the 3 wise men, that wasn't actually a bad little platformer, it was actually pretty fun, and, there weren't a lot of straight up Zelda clones to that degree of spiritual warfare either, and that was a pretty fleshed out game, so uh, that's gonna be my answer for sort of those are actually kind of hidden gems in a certain way that I think a lot of people didn't really give a second look to and just kind of, like to laugh at just because they're kind of the hokey third party games with Bible questions, and it's easy to make fun of them.
So that's fair to say, and I think one of the biggest downfalls or biggest what have yous against those games was the sheer amount of people that just couldn't play them. So like you mentioned that spiritual warfare, and I took a quick little looked at like a picture of it or what have you, and yeah, it does look like a decent-ish Zelda kind of clone. But like the biggest, I think, downfall to these games were you couldn't play them on any Nintendo that was made after like 90 or sorry, 88, 89. My Nintendo that I still have was a 1990 model, I believe. And that came out after Nintendo did um the chip that basically locks out any game that they personally did not put their stamp into. Um, and well, I remember trying to rent these games, and I remember trying one or two of them at my sitters who had a Nintendo that could play these games. I personally was never able to, and I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons people can't look at them as critically, or sorry, people back then couldn't look at them in like not such a critical, these are Bible game ways. So you saying that and like seeing the screenshot and seeing that it looks decent at the very least. It's I think it's just unfortunate that most people just would not have had the ability to have that hot take. I hope what I'm saying makes any sense whatsoever.
I totally get it. Plus, it's not like they had nearly as, like, wide distribution because of the whole, you can't sell unlicensed games here and that, and you could only buy them in, like, Christian bookstores or whatever. Like, they're definitely an oddity for sure, but they're not as entirely terrible as a lot of people like to say.
And, I'll also throw this out kind of as not as a counter to what you're saying, but kind of as like a parallel. There were also a lot of bad licensed games, or licensed in the sense of approved or what have you, games on the Nintendo. So, it's not like these were exclusively the only, potentially bad games or janky games or what have you, right? Like the Nintendo had a lot of games, a lot of bad ones too.
Oh, yeah, yeah, definitely. There were tons of bad games, but, and even like I'm saying with the unlicensed ones, with some of the Wisdom Tree ones, like, some of them are pretty close to unplayable going back, but, not all of them are, and there were a couple of, like, sorta hidden gems that are in there if you're into those genres. So if I was to pick one sort of from each genre, it would be like, I mean, obviously, like, I mean, Spiritual Warfare for Zelda, like, it was the only one they did, and it was, it's kind of surprising the scope of where that game goes, and then, I mean, Exodus was just kind of a fun, puzzle game kinda thing, like, if you like, um just that type of game, and, their platformers were mostly pretty rough, but I think that Three Wise Men one that was in King of Kings again, that was actually pretty cool. There were some cool ideas in there.
So, thank you for that. And I'm not gonna lie, when you said you had a hot take, I was bracing myself to hear you say something like Silver Surfer wasn't that bad, or some of those LJNs. So, um, on the grand scheme of how braced I was, that could have been a much hotter take. Is all I'm gonna say. I guess it could have been so much higher than that.
I think
Um,
too, the fact that they're unlicensed and what I do now is unlicensed, I kinda got a little bit of love just for unlicensed stuff in general, just because it's like, I don't know. There was always something even back then, like seeing cartridges that were like a different color and shape that was kinda like, "Oh, this is different."
Yeah, and it was exciting, right? Like, I
Yeah.
remember, because I don't know how or why the rental place had, a Bible game or 2. I only tried that one once or twice maybe or something, but they also had, that Dizzy's Adventure, like, 3 or 4 pack or something, the little egg guy
Oh,
from the
yeah.
UK,
Yeah.
and every time I rented it multiple times thinking it would be different, thinking it would be better because of the cartridge. And it was never better. It was never different. And like every time I rented it, we'd go back. My mom would be like, "It didn't work," and she'd go, "Okay, well, here's your money back." Like they would give us a free rental, because you know what have you. But I think like after the like third or fourth time, my mother was like, "Just stop. Just give it up. Just we're not doing this again. Like just go rent Turtles again. Like stop. Give it up. Call it a day." Um, So, and kind of in the same vein to what I just asked about a Nintendo game or, Nintendo games that you feel didn't get enough credit. And I imagine this is going to be another hot take-ish kind of question. I'm wondering if there was a Nintendo game that you don't feel holds up today to the way it should, or a game like a Nintendo game that was, how do I put it? Um, that you feel people are wrong about. Sorry, that's way too negative. Just a game, a Nintendo game that that when you if you went back to, you're like, oh, this doesn't hold up as well as I had thought it did, or what have you.
Um, let's see. If I was to pick a game that was sort of one of the popular games that I never really got into back then, and I've tried, honestly, it might be Contra, because that's like, and it's such a, because it's kind of like one of the iconic, it's by Konami and all that stuff, but I think it's a game that, like, especially if you don't use, like, the code, um I almost feel like the contra code, because everybody knew it, was, like, necessary to play the game. Because if you're gonna play it without that, you're just gonna die in, like, 3 seconds. Um, you need to know how to play it, and maybe I just never took the time to, um, get good at it or whatever, but it was just a game I never clicked with me.
So I can definitely relate to what you just said there. I empathetically feel that one. Like I didn't play a lot of the Contra on Nintendo. I played my father and I rented it for the Super Nintendo a few times. Except we didn't know about the Contra code. So we would get to like the third or fourth level, and that was it. Like that was our wall, right? And like, the game over, you'd restart. And it's just me now realizing that like how inherently necessary the Contra code or the Konami code um was or is for those games for a casual player. Um it's it's wild, just like how they didn't get blasted harder for how hard they are, like um I I don't know if people even still use this term. I think it's just I don't think it's outdated. I think it just doesn't exist in most people's lexicon anymore. But like back in that day, or back in like the early Nintendo days for like Nintendo and Super, Nintendo hard was a statement that was used to describe games. And in most cases, in my memory at least, it was usually due to like technical choices, like Ninja Gaiden, or like Castlevania, where the limitations of how you could play the game influenced how difficult the game would be. Um, Contra's solution to that being a cheat code that you had to know. Um, thinking about it now, like it's kind of shocking that it made it like it got further than people just saying this game's way too hard and leaving it to whatever,
Yeah, it's a thing I've heard. Kind of people almost get conspiratorially about the difficulty of old video games, but I think a lot of it, and this is one I saw, I can't even remember who it was an interview with, but they're asking about why the games are so difficult. And what it really was, because I know a lot of people say it's like, oh, it's for the rental market. You get people to so they wouldn't get too far in the game, they'd want to rent it again and all this kind of stuff. But what it really actually, and what I really believe it actually came down to, um, and I really wish I could source where I got this from, but it was one of the older Japanese devs from the 80s, and he just said that they just got good at their own games while they were developing it, and they wanted to so they didn't and I can empathize with that, because a lot of people, when I make games, people will say that they're like, every game I've released, someone will say that it's like brutally hard, and um it's all been small teams, working on these games, and I think that really is what it is, because when you've got a small team working on a game, you're constantly testing it yourself. You got to keep things interesting. You start worrying, oh, is it too boring? Is it too easy? And so you might add an enemy here. You might, reduce your health bars or do something. You know what I mean? And because you don't want it to be, the one thing you don't want your game to be is boring. And I think when you get too good at your own game, then trying to keep yourself from being bored, it is a risk that you can take, that it can end up becoming too difficult as a result. And I think that's just, I mean, a lot of these games were developed with teams of, 5 people or something, just, very similar to what an indie team would be nowadays, like 5 or 10 people. And they just got good at their own games. I think that's really where it came from. And I think a lot of people, there wasn't as much backlash to it back then, because it's what everything kinda was. So you had that sort of patience to try over again. And there were some games that I think were a little bit more tolerable to do that with, than others. And, with Contra, it was just one that I didn't really have the patience to do. I kinda like, if it was a game that was harder, I kinda gravitated towards things like the Mega Man games, but I think the level selection on those, um really helped in its favor, because if you found one level too hard, there was like 7 other levels you could try, so you didn't necessarily feel like you had a wall, and then you'd find another level, and, you get stuck on one level, you try another level, and then you'd sort of gain those skills organically, and then you might go back to that other level that was hard and be like, "Hey, I figured out how to get by that part." And, I think that's why especially for those early games, Mega Man really kinda stood out as good design, in that way, because you weren't gonna get bored because there was sort of always another option.
So, thank you for that. I hadn't heard the I hadn't heard about them being hard just because the devs got good at their game. That makes perfect sense as well. As you were talking, I realized what I had said was very much through the lenses of like today. Um, and like thinking back on it, a hard game then also would have had like the methodology of like arcades where things came from. Scores were an important thing. So like just that whole ecosystem of keeping you going without having to pay a quarter or two every time was also a big part of it, and why they would have been or could have been a little more difficult than what you would expect otherwise or what have you. But so thank you for everything you said just made me take off the made me put on the nostalgia glasses, I guess you would say, and be like, no, this is I forgot the context of so many other parts of it. But I really like the no, we just get good at our games. That's why they're so hard. And like it makes sense, right? Like because it's not going to be until, and I imagine that holds true today, that you aren't letting people try your games until you're comfortable with where they are, that it's a proper representation of what you want it to be, regardless of it being like an early alpha, beta, what have you, what have you, what have you. So like it's still going to be based around what you've gotten good at. And if you've gotten good at, running through these levels and are trying to keep them exciting for you, you, until someone else plays it that's not played it before or what have you, it's going to be it could possibly be a slap in the face, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's kind of a common thing just with indie games in general, and, even trying to, like, develop puzzles and that sort of thing, like, sometimes, some hints might not be as obvious to you as someone else or that kind of thing. It's a common thing, I think, in indie development, because indie games always kind of they a lot of them have a reputation of being a little bit harder, and I think, a lot of it really isn't necessarily intentional, but it does come down to just the whole, um, small team thing.
So, speaking of or to the uh you designing it, and it's more obvious too, um as someone that's like made or did some like little D&D campaigns, or as someone that's made like a board game or two, and you're writing out like the scenario or the instructions or what have you. In your mind you're like, this makes perfect sense, and when you read it, it makes perfect sense to you. And you get lost in the fact that, well, yeah, it makes perfect sense because you designed it. The solution to your puzzle. Of course it makes sense, right? Like, so, yeah, I understand what you're saying, and yeah, it makes perfect sense. So, Thomas, I am curious about this as well. And I'm gonna step out of the context of the Nintendo. I'm gonna release you from the shackles of having to speak about the Nintendo. Or let me rephrase that. Intentionally have to speak about the shackled to speaking about the Nintendo. Um, but I am curious, what kind of games are you enjoying now? Like, how do you enjoy gaming now, and what is it that makes gaming enjoyable to you?
I mean, really, I think a lot of it is, I I'm finding, just maybe it's my age and just stuff that I've got, I've got kids and all that kinda stuff, but I don't have as much time to put into, long games as I used to, so just having either games that are, like, brief or that are easy to split up and digest that I can play over a long period of time, um, that kind of stuff is stuff that I really enjoy. I think and I do kind of gravitate just towards Nintendo franchises and stuff like that as well. 'Cause, like, the only real games that I played this year were Super Mario Wonder and Tears of the Kingdom. And I think it's just a matter of like what I actually have time for, and it's almost just kind of like gaming is kind of like comfort food for me at this point. So it's like, Mario Wonder, it's like, okay, you can just split that up. You can play a few levels here and there. And it was a great game. It was just fun. And Tears of the Kingdom, I played that for months, but again, it was kind of where it's such an open game. It was like there you could play it for a short period of time, you could play it for a long period of time. You could just kind of squeeze it in every now and then. You always felt like you were doing something, whether it was, mapping out the underground area or clearing a shrine or two or like that kind of stuff. Just I like things that are kind of easy to digest at this point.
So, as I do not have children, but I am 36. Um, I think 30. I'm mid 30s at the very least. I don't remember right now. But as someone that is of the age where I need to worry about adulting more, I 100% agree with shorter games. Shorter games are fantastic. Um, you know, there's a whole myriad of reasons. I don't think we need to or have time to really delve into that one, but I agree completely. Shorter games or short games that are easy to digest in short chunks are always nice in my mind. Um, and now you had mentioned that like gaming now is like your comfort food kind of thing. So I'm curious, what is if you have one, like do you have a best comfort game or a comfort game that you know the type of comfort game that you might gravitate to, which I realize might just be short, which is perfectly fine. But comfort games. Speak, please. I'm gonna stop trying to screw up a question.
I mean, I'd probably go with Zelda Link's Awakening. And I could replay that game start to end, like, forever, basically. I've just always really loved that game. Um, there is something I think the fact that it was, like, I was so into the first Zelda, um, I didn't actually have A Link to the Past for a while until sort of a while after it came out. So it wasn't I never quite really had that nostalgia for A Link to the Past, but I did have Link's Awakening, and I was in a I had a pretty big family. When I was a kid, there was 5 kids in my family. I was the oldest, but Game Boy was kind of good because it was like a system I could just play without having to share the TV or anything like that, and it was something I had saved up my own money and bought myself, so I didn't have to share it with anybody else. It was just kind of my thing. So, Link's Awakening just kinda became that game for me, and, it's a game I could just constantly go back to, and I do. I'll probably play the thing through once or twice a year.
So now I hope you don't mind me asking this. Usually I don't like to pry too deep into people's personal lives. Um, and that is a line that varies for person to person. Um, So, by all means, I apologize if this question is stepping over that line for you. However, a few years ago, we saw Link's Awakening get a remake. I'm curious if you handed that to your children, if your children, if they're old enough, if you handed that to them and just sort of tried to stand by and watch as someone played effectively the same game you feel incredibly nostalgic and, fuzzy or however you want to phrase it about through, getting to watch it through their eyes. I'm wondering if that was a thing. And again, I apologize if that question is past the line of comfort for you.
No, I kinda tried. My son, he's 17 now, so I'm trying to think how old he would have been. He still would have been a teenager when it came out. Um, so it's kind of he's kinda past the age where I can give him something, and, I did try to get him into it, but I just don't think he was quite as into it. He was still kind of he was hard into, I think, Animal Crossing, and he loves Minecraft. Um, and I don't think he was quite as captured by it as I was. I think if I had had a kid who was a little younger, it would have been different. And I actually do remember when my son was younger, I think he was around 6 years old, and we played through A Link to the Past together, and it was kind of a he played it until it got to a hard part, and he handed me the controller, and we played through the whole game back and forth like that, and that was a pretty cool experience doing that. And I think at that point, the age he was, Link's Awakening being a Game Boy game, um, was a little bit, less interesting, shall we say. I don't know. Just the idea of a Super Nintendo game, it just sorta has the brighter graphics, it's on a TV, and Super Nintendo is just a system that's aged so well, for a lot of people, so we did do that with Link to the Past, and I mean, it's a very similar game to Link's Awakening. So it was cool doing that with him, and I think um that's kind of where his Zelda nostalgia would come from was when we did that. So there's kind of that connection in that way. But just something about the weird quirkiness of Link's Awakening. It's something that's why it's the one I always go back to.
So, thank you for sharing that. And, as I said, hopefully that wasn't too much of a line. However, speaking of the weird quirkiness of Link's Awakening, yeah, I played through it or most of it years and years and years ago. When I was an actual verifiable child. And getting to replay it now, like the Switch version was was fantastic because I don't remember if I beat it when I was younger, but I remembered it being all kinds of weird, right? Because as far as Zelda games go, even as far as Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, Link's Awakening was still an incredibly weird game with all of the weird little self references or Nintendo references or what have you. So I'm happy more people today have an easier time to experience that game. And I know, and I say that in like, kind of in the same way that for any of like the remakes of these old games where people say things like, why are we getting remakes? It's like, well, because, that was 30 years ago and those games are one, hard to get. And two, there's people now that can't, would not have been able to play them or can't stomach them or handle them, right? Because it's harder to play. Like I have a Game Boy sitting next to me, and it's very difficult to go back to for me, just because it's an actual dot matrix Game Boy screen, right? Like my memory of how I engaged with it is very different, and expecting to be able to just walk up to someone in today, like a child now that has a cell phone or like uses a cell phone and go, here, play this thing. You have to sit under the light perfectly, but not in that
Yeah,
seat. You have to sit like, the amount of like variables and whatever is
yeah,
very difficult. And being able to just go, here's a Switch game of this game from like 20 years ago. Just play it, enjoy it, or try and
yeah,
like,
exactly.
it's so I'm happy to see that happening, especially as I said with Link's Awakening, because it's arguably one of the quirkiest, weird little Zelda games that just exists, just
Well, that's the
by the
thing,
very
and
nature of it.
it does things that, I mean, I'm not gonna spoiler alert a 30-year-old game or whatever, but, like, the stuff that it does, it does it so casually, you're just in a dungeon and there's, like, Goombas or piranha plants, and there's no explanation, they're just there, and then you're in another dungeon and Kirby's trying to eat you, and it's like, you just don't know what's being thrown at you, and there's things that, like, some of the stuff is so obscure in it, um, like when you go to that one house and it's playing the music from the Super Nintendo version of Sim City, and you have Mr. Right there, who's exactly the same as Dr. Right from Sim City, and it's just these things like, and I think a lot of people don't even get that reference, but I know I certainly did because I recognized the SimCity music playing in that room. Um, it's, uh it's stuff that kind of is, like, such deep cuts for no good reason with no explanation, it's just there, and, the whole game is so full of that, and it's just something that they just wouldn't do it again because it's so weird, but it's also, like it's kind of like it's a joy to go back to because it just has that weirdness, and, my wife actually played through the whole game on Switch, and she hadn't played it before, and I remember her just, going through the first dungeon, and all of a sudden there's Goombas there, and she's just like, "Why are there Goombas in a Zelda game? This is wrong." Like, 'cause it wasn't like they're in there as some kinda cameo, it's like, "No, there's just Goombas here, and you can jump on them." Like, it's I don't know. There's something about that just it was fun. I got to see her reaction out of it, so even though I didn't get to see one of my kids' reactions, I did get to see my wife's reaction. So there was that.
So, thank you for sharing that and expanding on just, exactly how quirky that game is and, how yeah, just how nice it is that it exists in a more current media.
Yeah.
Um, Now, Thomas, I don't want to take up too much more. Wow, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. However, I want to hit you with a quick one before I let you get on if you're Friday evening. Um, so, outside of games, what is it that you enjoy doing, and how do you relax? And if the answer is games, that's perfectly valid. I just like to ask this in the event that your whole existence is not games, and I would be remiss if that is what people were sold on, that everyone that makes games just lives games, you know?
No, I mean, mostly right now, and honestly, I don't do a whole lot of gaming these days outside of work. Um, we've my wife and I, we've got a daughter who just turned 17 months old today. So I got a 17-year-old and a 17-month-old at the same time right now, which is kind of funny. So just spending time with my kids. And where they're at such different ages because he's in grade 12, he's gonna be going to university next year. So that's like a crazy, you know, life changing thing happening with him, while at the same time we've got this, you know, younger one, she's 17 months and everything in life is brand new with her. So it's pretty just spending time with them, watching them grow and in their different ways is something that's I mean that's kind of where my life is. Um just just seeing that happen, and it just kind of is brings a lot of joy to my life, and um yeah, so it's kind of a funny one because like kids aren't really hobbies, but they certainly take up your time. So
That's entirely correct to say that kids aren't really hobbies. It's not like, you can't say, they're a hobby project raising them like you would say fixing a car is a hobby project or whatever. But, it's I from my understanding from parents I've spoken to, it at least seems like a good fun use of your time most of the time, right?
oh yeah, for sure, for sure. There's like absolutely it's definitely not something I would ever want to change is, being a parent. It's just it's it's great, and I mean, I've been doing it for a while, and I feel like I kinda started overdoing it again, and I don't I, like, I just it's incredibly rewarding, and, yeah.
So, that is absolutely fantastic and great to hear. And I think that is the best possible place to leave or leave my conversational interview with you at. So, Thomas, with all of that in mind, as I said, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. It is Friday for you. It's 5:30 on a Friday now. You're an hour ahead of me. So, for you, it's definitely getting close to dinner time. I don't want to steal, more of your time, interrupt your wind down, your what have you. However, if there was anything else you wanted to discuss, a cool game, more of what you're doing, or something you feel more people should just be more aware of, by all means, the floor is yours. As well, please let everyone know where they can find more information about you, which I'll also include in the episode description.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I guess the main thing right now is Rugrats Adventures in Gameland. That's coming out early next year. We're releasing it digitally through the NES Games, and there's going to be a physical release through Limited Run Games as well. So everyone can look forward to that. If anyone's interested in following me, my handle is Spoony Bard Toma on most social media. Um, I'm not super active on social media, but I am there and I do check it. So yeah, that's about it.
So awesome. So thank you. I will be sure to include, a link to the socials there, as well as the game, so that way people can actually learn more about it, or what have you. So that was just the way they know it exists. If they didn't know it exists, and if they didn't know it exists, that's a shame because they should. Um, but other than that, though, if there wasn't anything else, I will let you get back to your evening. I'll let you, enjoy your weekend.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks for talking to me. It was great.
Thomas, you're welcome. I always feel weird when people say thank you. I don't know how to properly go from there, but really the pleasure was all mine. I thank you for taking time out of your schedule to speak with me. I really appreciated it. And yeah, it was fun getting to talk Nintendo with you. I know that's kind of where we focused, but contextually, I think that makes the most sense.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure.
So thanks again to Thomas for making time to have this conversation with me, and thank you for joining us on the Red Tunic podcast, as well as a special thanks to Ron Jenkins for the use of music from the title track from Road Steep. And be sure to check out the episode description for links to socials, websites, and other means that allow you to learn more about or support Thomas and the project, Rugrats Adventures in Gameland being the project, as well as the podcast. And while you're doing that, share, like, follow, whatever else makes sense. Thanks until next time.